Hi, it's Steve Hargadon and Reed Hepler, and it's This Week in AI, July 19th, 2024. Well, Reed, it doesn't get any less busy, does it?
No, absolutely not. It's every day there's new stuff happening and new ways to apply AI, or maybe not. But we'll talk about that at the end. But every day there's something new that people are creating or startup businesses. So yeah.
Oh, good. When we do that deep dive, let's remember to talk about workflow
Yes.
rather than, what's the other phrase?
Multimodal tools.
Bimodal. Okay, so you want to run us through the news?
Yes, okay. So first of all, and this is interesting, 2 days ago, this is one of the later parts of the news, but GPT-4 Omni Mini was reduced, or was released. What is it called? GPT-4 Mini? I think it's called GPT-4 O Mini, but it's a smaller training. It's trained on a smaller set of data, but it's a better set of data allegedly. So it is faster, and it's best for most tasks. For more complex tasks, they encourage you to use GPT-4 Omni. But still, this is a tool that you can use, and it's less of a hassle and less um, cumbersome to use as an API. So they're releasing it for people to use online, but mostly I think they're releasing it for people to use in business applications and actual apps or programs. And so it'll be interesting to see if people actually use the mini. I know that there are some people and people are split in instructional technology on this. Half of them are saying it's very effective and can answer questions. The other half are saying, yes, it can answer questions, but I put, a 10-step prompt and it forgot the last step that I put in there. So, I mean, it's still a work in progress, but it exists. So much more feasible, much more affordable. And Sam Altman said he's like eventually, and GPT-4 Omni Mini is apparently partially a fulfillment of this. We're going to have processing power that you don't even have to charge for. Like it takes no money or no energy to do this. It's really, really simple. So we'll see how that works.
I'm sure that's a part of the appeal, right? Which is less carbon footprint, less energy
Yes.
use, all this kind of stuff. My first impression upon reading about Mini was this is headed toward mobile. I'm sure there are lots of applications where the speed and the size, because it's apparently super fast,
Uh,
where the speed and the size would make a difference for programmers. But I'm also thinking this would allow you to embed, like, why would I use the mini version if I'm on a PC and I have access to the full version?
exactly.
But
Yeah.
but maybe this is partly sort of to embed AI into and pretty much anything because it wouldn't take up that much of a footprint. That was my impression. I have no idea if it's true, but
No,
that
yeah,
was
that
my
makes
sense.
sense. And
Okay, what's
uh,
next? Oh, go
so the
ahead.
next, so the next one is, and this is kind of related to it. Well, not really related to it, but they came out on the same day. The Quizlet survey for the state of AI in education came out. It's the second year that this has come out, and I have qualms about an ed tech company with users and commercial interest publicizing and conducting a survey for to educators. I mean, most of the people who did this were people who are using Quizlet already. There's so many confounding factors, I can't even list them all. But nevertheless, it's a massive survey and people like it. But in this survey, which was ostensibly unbiased, only 46% of teachers and 36% of students said that AI will be helpful in education, as opposed to about a 20% increase last year. So less people are saying that AI will be helpful in education. And a bunch of people are like, oh, the AI age is over. AI is not going to be as helpful as it is. And then 56% of educators say that they're going to be more deliberate and pragmatic in their use, which means that they're going to use it. They're just going to be more measured about it. But still, people are using these stats to say that people aren't going to use AI. AI is over in education. I think this is a question of we're not understanding how AI was going to be used in education. And then when they saw, that, oh, I can't make, simulations and videos right off the bat, they were like, oh, I'm just going to give up on entirely. So, I think a lot of people aren't using it effectively or productively because they don't know how to do it. Like they're putting in weak prompts, and then when they get lame answers, they're like, oh, that doesn't work. But anyway, so Quizlet survey is interesting. You might want to look into that. Keep an eye. Again, it is by an ed tech company, but I thought it was really interesting that
Being by
that was
an
the
ed
turnout.
being by an ed tech company didn't bother me. I know Quizlet, and they were a great success story uh,
Okay.
within the ed tech world, and I liked them.
Okay.
And so that doesn't bother me. I saw a survey by another commercial outfit, it's Chrome Unboxed, and they catered to people who use Chromebooks. And they said they surveyed their audience, and Chromebooks have been sort of early ways to integrate Gemini into the user experience. And I'm
Uh-huh.
a big Chromebook user. And Chrome Unboxed did a survey and said 50% of their audience said they just don't use AI at all. And those who do, sometimes it's often super minimal. We're going to talk about the sort of the overpromise and underdeliver aspect of AI in a
Uh-huh.
moment, and the sort of the way in which there are commercial interests in promoting AI.
Uh-huh.
Do you want to talk at all about the you referenced in a conversation earlier this week this difference between the use of AI as a chatbot as a tutor and the perception of the students versus just the prompt line use of AI. Do you
So
remember
yeah,
that?
well, and this is interesting because there was a study, and I think we talked about it earlier this week, of people who they had a a regular ChatGPT model, and then they had a group of students who weren't using AI at all, and then they had a group of students who were just using a specialized custom GPT tutor, and they found that the compared to the control group, those who used both ChatGPT tutors did really well, and those who used the specialized tutor did better than the standard GPT. And then they found that people who just used the standard GPT um, did worse off than those who used a specialized tutor when both of those were taken away. So the people who used the specialized tutor and were thinking of it, allegedly they were thinking of it as a tutor, when that was taken away, they had a better time adjusting than when the other students had no access to ChatGPT. I think that really is a question of the role of the AI. First of all, that they were viewing it as a tool. The people who knew it was a tutor and who were using, it was labeled as probably, this course is tutor or something like, or this subject tutor. And so they knew what it was. And then the ones who said standard chat GPT, they were kind of, um, they were drawn to or probably led to just see it as another AI conversation bot. And so it was a difference in perspective that shaped what they were doing. I also think it looks like they didn't really train these students. And so I think something that confounds that is they didn't train the students to think of it in a correct way. They didn't train them to prompt it correctly. They didn't train to think through what they were doing. And I think again with this survey, and with the Chrome Unboxed survey, which I was going to talk about later, but it's good that you brought it up now because it's a similar thing. It's people who are not understanding how to use it. And above get mad that I'm saying this, but you need to know how to use a tool before you use it. It shouldn't be, it might seem second nature, but it's not. It's a totally different thing. So
So let's be honest about how most people are going to encounter and learn about and interact with large language models. It will probably be like the students who just have the prompt and no training. So I
yeah,
feel like that's really likely. And so if we think about this in terms of framing and expectations, right? There's this frame and expectation with the command line, and when a very human language responds back, that it's sort of all knowing and will be able to do anything.
yeah,
But when you frame it as a tutor, your expectation is it's here to help me, and I'm the primary thinker in the equation. So I think that was a really profound moment for me when you brought that up, where I thought, okay, this is really important to frame in education. Most people are going to encounter large language models outside of good framing.
uh,
But within education, it feels like there's a responsibility to frame this correctly, in large part, because the language capability makes it seem so human and capable, right?
yes,
So
yes,
if you don't
yes,
have training, you're going to think this is going to answer everything. I've had so many experiences in the last couple of weeks where I have felt like Claude refusing to answer questions. I don't think that's an appropriate question. Like, oh,
Uh-huh.
this is really interesting. What my ability to go into a library and pick up a book on something I don't agree with, I need to be able to get an answer.
Yeah.
I'm not comfortable that you are now telling me this is not appropriate. And if I don't have the good frame and understanding of how large language models work, I might think, oh, I shouldn't be asking that question because a very intelligent sounding voice is telling me don't talk about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
Uh-huh.
I think this is I felt like that was a really crucial point. We can keep
Well,
going, but thanks for
yes. Well,
bringing
and
that
that's
up.
interesting. The enculturation that happens, or the acculturation, depending on what you would want to frame it as, of technology use is that we are being introduced into this culture, and AI is influencing our culture and how we think and what we believe, and people aren't really keying into that. So,
Can I
related
spend
to
one
that,
can I
sorry,
spend one more second on that?
yeah,
This is probably worth drilling down just briefly.
yeah,
So I encountered that with Claude, and I thought, okay, this is really interesting. And I said, what's the training process? And of course, there's the training on the cultural data, which has its inherent biases, and then there's the shaping of the responses based by humans who are looking for sort of political correctness. I thought, I wonder how pervasive that is. So I said, are there countries where there's an explicit um, expectation by the government that the large language models will or will not produce certain information? And it came back and said, yes, this is actively going on. And I thought, oh, okay, so when we take it out of the context of our world to the United States,
uh-huh.
very clearly you would say, oh, yeah, people are going to try and shape the responses. And then I don't know if you read the article about China, but China
Yes,
has sent
uh,
out all of these people to go to different companies and make sure that their large language models conform to their restrictions on what can be talked about and in what ways it should be talked about. So
uh-huh.
it's sort of immediately I went from this, oh, I'm kind of this gadfly worrying about whether or not AI's responses are going to shape public perception, to realizing this is actually being done in a large scale way. We're just a little bit naive about it. And so
Yes,
we have to remember that when you have a large language model that sounds human, has the influence of human emotion in its voice, and the responses are being shaped by people in power and control who have agendas, our frame has to be very careful here. And so in a lot of ways, what you and I did in that first session of the productivity boot camp, the framing of AI is really important in education.
yes. Well, and exactly, it's especially when, I mean, China thought it was so important that they sent people out there to control what they were saying. So they obviously know, or think at least, that this is going to be a very powerful communicative tool and that people are going to trust it. They have a very implicit belief that they're going to trust the AI tool. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And
So
then
we should.
back on the American side, a lot of Americans believe that generative AI has consciousness, that it's sentient. We've fallen into the trap that Google engineer went into, of that AI has consciousness, that it's sentient, that it wants to do things that necessarily we aren't giving it to do. And so it's just kind of crazy. I really like the Lance Elliott article. It goes really deep into like what is consciousness, and it's really intriguing. I don't even know how to say it without like reading half of it, but
Yeah. So
it's
this is
really
from Forbes
intriguing.
magazine,
Yes,
Forbes
from
Online.
Forbes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So and you and I probably both know parents who have very much limited their children's access to Alexa or Google
Yes.
because they
Yes.
noticed that the children felt like they were actually talking to a person. Certainly the same thing's going to be true with large language models and the response. Yeah, no, it's the perception or even the mimicking of humanness and consciousness is definitely something you and I have talked a lot about and being careful with.
Yeah. It's yeah. I would encourage you also to read that again. That's Lance Elliott on Forbes magazine. Really interesting, really deep. I'm not going to get into it right now, but it's intriguing to think of how it's going to affect the family. In fact, there was an article. It was before we did. This Week in AI. But basically, this programmer's daughter, he had talked to ChatGPT, he had talked to Alexa, and so the daughter actually thought of those tools and their names as members of her family because, like, they had talked about them so much and talked about them as if they were human. And so, of course, if we're talking about someone who's human to a 4 or 5 year old, they're going to think that they're human. So, and so it was kind of interesting to kind of deconstruct that and have him say, no, it's not. That's not what it is. A little bit. So going back a little bit from that, and these two next two things are uh, related to each other. Um, AI innovators, a lot of AI users have hit what's called the trough of disillusionment. This is not according to a study. This is according to one um, social scientist's analysis of the advancements, and he's kind of mapping these advancements to the trough of disillusionment graph. Which, if you know what it is, it goes up and up and up, it goes down, and then it goes up and plateaus. And so I am intrigued by that. I don't know how valid his analysis is going to be because it's just one person. But related to that, another Forbes article: why confidence in your unique skills is crucial in the age of AI. I think that we need to be connecting our skills to AI. We can't be expecting AI to do everything, especially if we don't put our own knowledge and our own skills into it. So yes, people have hit the trough of disillusionment, but only if they had inflated expectations. I can say that I've been pro AI this whole time. I can't say that I thought that AI was going to completely remove my role as a librarian, like some people thought it was going to do. So
Yeah, I think this is important for sure. I think that we do have um, we're still all feeling the elephant, right? There's this enormous thing that's called AI. They're still trying to figure out how it works. We're all encountering little parts of it, and we are trying to extrapolate what the whole elephant looks like from the little parts that we feel. Um, Certainly, this is legitimate. Um, okay, I've got some more thoughts, but I'm gonna pause until we do our deep dive.
okay, yes. Then we have um, well, this is kind of it's not really news, but it's an analysis of and this is not news to a lot of people who know what language models are, but language models like ChatGPT-4 memorize more than they reason, a study finds. And anybody who knew about neural networks and how they operate could have told you that. But it's interesting that a study did that and people are actually paying attention that it's about data and it's not about, reasoning and logic. Like we've said, like you say a lot, language versus logic. It's not based on language, or it's not based on logic, it's based on language. So it's nice that people are doing that and realizing that and actually paying attention to that fact right
Yeah,
now.
so it was pretty dramatic, like from a 90 something percent accuracy using traditional mathematics to changing to a different numerical system where if it was reasoning, it wouldn't have had a problem. But because it seemed to be pattern based and having adopted patterns from the training, it had
Uh,
like a 20% success rate. So it's pretty dramatic.
so it seemed like it was accurate. It seemed like it was doing okay, but when you actually assessed for reasoning, it was awful.
There's a
Yeah.
little bit of a theme going on for us here, right? It's almost like we have these innate cognitive triggers or shortcuts for establishing things, right? So
Uh,
we certain things indicate consciousness or humanness to us. Certain things indicate truth. Certain things indicate accuracy. So again, just having to be really careful to recognize that our feelings that something is accurate don't necessarily mean it is. When it's like,
that's a really good point. That's a really good point. You should talk about that in today's session, which, by the way, today's session, 3.5 hours. We're going into our second session of the professional productivity with ChatGPT and AI bootcamp. Really impressive. You should talk about that in your intro today if you want to. I don't know if it'll be relevant to what you're saying, but that's a really good point. Is that we tend to think that it's conscious and that it's human, even if we've been trained, even if we know that it's not. We tend to just even if like it sneaks into the way we interact with it a lot. Yeah, that's a really good point. Very good point. Uh, and then we have three more news things. One of them, which is really impressive, a representative from Washington used AI to restore her voice. She's a representative and she lost her voice and she's using AI to get it back and to talk and to communicate with people. I'm sorry, it's not Washington. She's from Virginia. It's from this article is in the Washington Post, but it is Virginia. And because she has a disease, a degenerative disease, um, and she was able to talk with people. So that was just amazing. That's really cool.
Yeah. So the
And like
character, that was a brilliant, it was a sort of a beautiful human piece, right?
yeah,
That it's not just that's like a robotic voice, it is actually her voice and her intonation. They're saying that they within a few seconds, like literally 3 to 5 seconds of hearing someone's speech, AI is now able to generate a reasonable facsimile of that person's speaking, tone, style, timbre, all of that. Um,
wow.
there was a, I don't remember which story it was in, but I screenshotted this. It was the video that was labeled as a Tucker Carlson clip. But when the person went back and watched it, they were taken aback. It sounded like Carlson, but it was word for word something that this person had said himself on his own YouTube show. So
Huh.
someone took the text of what he said, put it into Tucker Carlson's voice, and then posted it on TikTok. He
Wow.
was equally alarmed that only one of the video's commenters seemed to recognize that it was a fake. So this is pretty, I mean, we haven't really dived
Huh.
deeply into this recently, but the brilliance of someone being able to recreate their voice, the brilliance of being able to have a conversation or hear things by someone who has passed on, the
Uh-huh.
licensing of certain voices. We didn't talk about that much last week, but it was a story for us where uh, the person's image and voice were being licensed to be used, right? Somebody who was a famous person, to then this use of AI for deep fakery, right? And again, we have these limited cognitive triggers. We hear someone's voice in a certain pattern, and it sounds like something that they would say. Our mental shortcut is, oh, okay, I'm going to listen. I'm going to listen carefully. I'm going to believe this. It's why certain people can be so effective and eloquent and persuasive when they're not necessarily saying something that is true, because we have mental shortcuts for establishing truthfulness and authenticity.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people, especially and you mentioned putting deceased family members or deceased loved ones' voices in this or likenesses. Like for a second, I was like, boom, I could put my grandpa's voice in there. But then I would realize, do you realize how Black Mirror-ish that is? Like
Yes.
how that's chilling. That's crazy. You could do it, but it wouldn't be the same. And if you if you interact like it is your grandfather or your relative, it just screws with your head. It
Okay.
has the capacity to if you're
I'm
not
going to go
careful.
down. I'm going to go down this rabbit hole for just a minute.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
So let's assume that we have video clips of someone that we loved in our lives, right?
Yes.
And we post them, and we post the text messages and the emails, and the AI is capable of adopting the voice and recreating it to some degree. AI is also going to get very good at psychographic profiling. So it's going to kind of understand the personality of the person. And you
Yes.
are essentially going to be, this is my prediction, you're going to be able to have a conversation and not just on things that were previously recorded and available, but to talk to your grandfather the way he would talk to you without
Yes.
any previous stored data about his opinions on that, but able to predictive ability. And then I'm going to predict that we're going to build a relationship with that AI personality, which will supersede the relationship we had with the person. But the AI personality will actually be more real to us because we have faded memories of the actual person. So we're going to have to figure out if this is okay, right?
Yeah.
Is this
That's
okay
true.
that my relationship with this sentient sounding AI that actually is capable of not just mirroring the voice and the look and appearance, but the thinking, the pattern of thinking, the psychological profile, that's going to become that person for me. And do I really want that?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Yeah. That and then yeah, I mean that could affect human relationships too, because if you think it is, but somebody else doesn't think it is, or you could forego talking to other people about things because you could talk to the facsimile of someone because that person's always been your mentor, all these things.
I'm
It's really
breaking up with you, but I'm going to keep dating your avatar.
yes, exactly. See, that's really problematic. Yeah, it could be. Um, that Wow. See, that's another issue as well. So we're gonna go back to the news. That's really intriguing. Um, the OpenAI company has established 5 steps to AGI, allegedly, ostensibly. I don't think they have gotten as far as I think they have, but we're only a third of the way there. Apparently, ChatGPT 4 Omni and ChatGPT 4 were big, big steps. The first level is chatbots. The second level is reasoners. So we talked about language, not logic. They want to do logic now. Um, well, human level problem solving. And so is that really reason? That doesn't necessarily mean reason. That means being able to solve problems,
Yeah.
which is not necessarily the same thing. And then you have your agents doing, basically multimodal, but connected to your desktop. And then innovators and then organization-wide open AI tool or AI tools. I don't know if that's going to be effective or, if they're going to be able to do that, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on that roadmap? Do you think it's plausible? I don't think it is.
Yeah, I'm intrigued both by what OpenAI is saying and by why I think they might be saying it. Right.
Yeah.
So when Ilya goes to start the safe superior intelligence program company, when there's a lot of concern about safety, I think showing a roadmap that seems reasonable and reasonable transitions probably makes people feel better. That doesn't necessarily mean it's entirely accurate. OpenAI has sort of a pattern of shockingly moving from one step to the next in terms of
Yeah.
its public announcements. So,
Yes.
when they finish in August, with whatever the revamp of 4.0, with whatever safety controls they have built in, and then 5, I fully expect us to be kind of blown away. I know, again, so this is just my perception that they're going to want it to look like it's a reasonable progression because there's so many concerns about it. But I think we're going to be blown away. And I continue to believe that the use of AI to build AI is going to dramatically shorten the cycle process, that there's going to be a lot that will go on. Um, I think that we could both say pretty reasonably that the power of AI for governments, for large scale institutions, and the like is hard to overstate.
Yeah.
And there's so much interest here. And I think so. A lot of it, I think we're going to see here, I'm going to put into the category of public messaging because it may not actually represent the progress being made. Um, I want to coin a phrase, and obviously Lemming is never taken off, so I may not be good at coining phrases, but I think there's a reasoning dilemma, right? Which is, we've talked about this. I don't think that people, the companies and organizations and institutions and governments that currently hold power are going to want a fully reasoning AI, because then all of the stories that are not fully true, the the Freedom of Information Act information that's not released,
Uh-huh.
the acknowledgement that we didn't tell the truth in certain circumstances historically. I think a fully reasoning AI is actually dangerous to existing power structures. And
Mhm.
so this is another thing. I think there's a dilemma here, which is we say we want fully reasoning AI, but fully reasoning AI will see through the propaganda and the persuasion and the manipulation, and that's going to be there's tension there in a big
Yes,
way.
well, and it could contravene its training data. Exactly. It could see through what people are trying to do to it. It could develop, kind of biases of its own against things.
Yeah.
Yeah, all sorts of stuff.
I put
Uh,
the blue screen of death in our news because this is
yes,
happening today. The
yes.
Windows update that took place today, Friday, July 19th, 2024. Don't know how widespread it is, but planes have been grounded. It sort of seems like it's unrecoverable from the actual individual PC. Like, people are going to have to go in and fix the BIOS in those PCs. To me, it was a reminder of the fragility of the larger electronic universe, right? Which
Uh-huh.
is, we're talking about AI like it's not going to stumble or fall or have problems, and there could be sort of problems associated just with the programming and the nature of sentience and all the things we've talked about. But there's also the fact that an EMP could take out, most of the electronics in an area. And if we become really dependent and reliant on AI, especially for tasks that involve life-saving kinds of procedures, we just have to be careful, because again, it's a reminder of the fragility. An article I read this morning compared the blue screen of death today to the Y2K, that it's actually more impactful than Y2K.
Oh,
Maybe
definitely.
that's hyperbole, but again, it's a reminder that the electronic world is fragile.
Well, in the blue screen of death, which ironically, I've only had blue screens of death once after a Windows update, and another time after I installed a local LLM. So both times related to technology, obviously related to technology, but one about a Windows update. It was unintentional, obviously. I mean, or maybe it was intentional. Maybe it was surreptitious. But Y2K was expected. Blue screen of death was not expected, and you can see, and this will take us into our deep dive, how over reliance on any type of technology is dangerous. I mean, I'm going to go on a flight on Sunday, and that affects flights. But furthermore, that affects. I mean, it used to be in airports that you would have the local people managing the airport systems. Now it's like a whole network of airports having a coordinated display thing from some other company because they can manage everything, and it's better to have a centralized management of all these things. And so as we centralize things, as we over rely on technology, as we make certain things, AI, business, transportation, synonymous with centralized control or reliance on a certain technology, if those things fail, then everything else fails with it. So yeah, kind of crazy. A live demonstration of what can happen if we over rely on over promises. So
And this is a dilemma, right? It's not just that we've talked about the Amish test and whether or not the technology matches the sort of the cultural goals that we have for ourselves, but
yes.
it's also the degree to which Kevin Kelly talks about technology develops a life of its own. It moves forward. There will be somebody who will implement a technology if it captures attention or money or energy. And so there is a degree to which it's a little bit out of control, and we're not very good at thinking in sort of pattern predictable ways to make sure that things are smooth. And I think we also have to be very careful, because we're in a situation with sort of large financial precariousness, like an enormous derivatives market and all kinds of financial transactions that depend on electronics, and increasingly, I think, on AI and supercomputers. And so, as the as the as that grows larger, it seems like the risk grows greater. Like the inability to sort of stop and say, how do we make sure we have backup systems, and how do we make sure that those are very hard things to do in the midst of growth and under pressure, right? So I do, again, there's a fragileness here and a precariousness, and the blue screen of death, I think, is a reminder that things can go wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, want to deep dive for a second?
Yes, let's go for a deep dive in for a second. We took a little bit longer on the news things than I thought we would, but this is really good, and we've talked about this a little bit a lot. But AI has been overpromising. And I think it's a mix of AI overpromising and AI implying that it can do things and people not getting that, but then also people overthinking. Like you have practitioners or non-professionals who are saying, "I'm going to use AI to do this," and it's a completely unfounded assertion. And then when they fail, then like, "Oh, AI is awful. I wasn't able to do this thing that it shouldn't have done in the first place." But AI has a massive carbon footprint. And then again, they're reducing that, which is really good. Oh, good on OpenAI for reducing that, or trying to at least. We're going to have impacts on education, on training, and we think it's still going to happen. Otherwise, I don't think we would be doing this boot camp. It was going to have massive effects on medicine and treatment, and we're seeing that really isn't playing out in as many ways as people thought it was going to.
Yeah. So I think I come at this from the perspective of having watched the education revolution cycle, where technology sort of seemed to promise an opportunity to really reinvent education. And I'm not going to rehearse the conclusions I've come to, but essentially, I think that we think it has greater promise to make large scale social change than it actually does, because of the vested interests of the organizations that are involved and the ways of thinking. So I don't think it's going to be a dramatic revolution. I think what we're seeing is some of what we see in education as well, which is there are financial interests in being first to the gate and making promises. And like that LA school district story with the
Yeah.
chatbot, right?
Mhm.
There's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of desire, um, authentic desire to improve things and to make things better. But I'm getting all kinds of emails promising all kinds of productivity. And like we're talking about in the boot camp today, you almost have to have this sort of ruthless willingness to cut away all of the extraneous and actually just do the things that are productive. So we've looked at, rather than the sort of multimodal all solution kind of promises, what are the specific tools that actually make your job better and easier today, and kind of being ruthless about not getting caught up in all of the other stuff and just using those tools that make things better for you in a sequential fashion. So I use this tool to build the image because ideogram is so much better than Gemini or the multimodal 4.0 in terms of generating an image that I can actually work with and make better. And I
Uh-huh.
use this particular tool for transcribing, right? And I use this particular tool for evaluating YouTube videos before I watch the whole video. And I use this particular tool to learn about a book so I can decide. Those things really dramatically improve my productivity.
Uh-huh.
But if I believe that all of a sudden with one fell swoop, everything is going to become more productive, it's just a that's just a mistake. It's a human mistake. The desire. It's almost like the kid who wants the chat GPT prompt to write the essay and to do all the schoolwork, right? And then realizing that when it's framed as a tutor, it's much better. So we need to kind of at least for me, I think we need to reframe our expectations around productivity in terms of very specific tools that actually do things for us. Grammarly does something for us that's worth paying for, that makes my day better. So I'm just going to identify those. It will make me more productive, but I'm not going to pretend that there's going to be this massive increase in personal productivity just because I bought into somebody's message.
Yes. Yeah.
That was a little bit of a soapbox.
No, that's really good. I was thinking as you were saying this that COVID happened, and not to get political, because when a medical condition isn't really political, I would hope. But COVID-19 happened in November 2020, no, 2019, and then the pandemic ended, was it 2 years? 2 years after?
I guess
Um,
it depends on what. I mean, the people are still getting
or
boosters, and Biden just got COVID, so I
yes,
don't know
that's
that people
true.
would say,
Well,
you know,
but officially, according to people, the pandemic ended, I think, like 2 years after. And then basically what I'm trying to say is that AI has been here for 1.5 years. So we're almost, I mean, and now, like you say, Biden just got COVID. At ALA, the American Library Association, someone just got COVID. And what I'm basically, it's now kind of COVID is not the biggest thing anymore. Like it's massive, it's here to stay, it's all over the place, but it's no longer a pandemic style thing. And we've moved on, at least from a public discourse, everyone's talking about it all the time, wearing masks all the time. AI for I think probably almost that long, or ChatGPT has at least. And so um it'll be interesting to see if it continues or if like COVID or I don't know, it was Trump probably was the thing before then. If something else comes to replace it in our public discourse so much.
I don't. I personally think this is a long-term story. I think that
Okay.
I do buy the hype. I do believe that this is comparable to the advent of the internet, right? That it's a technology which there's a good reason why it's gotten such publicity and so many resources poured into it. But I also believe that it's going to get integrated into most things that we do. So whereas we might have these sort of grand promises of productivity, just looking at AI, I think it's more likely that when we use Canva, we'll use the AI in it. When we use Google Drive, we'll use the AI in it. When we use Gmail, we'll use the AI in it. That it will become somewhat pervasive in what we do. But that's again a good argument because as it becomes more pervasive and a little more invisible, I think it's important to remember the framework, right? That language isn't logic. And so, again, and like you have said so many times, you are ultimately responsible as the human being for the output. So make sure that you're using it as a collaborative tool, using it for research, but that you're checking it, and then ultimately the conclusions are yours.
Yeah, yeah. No, this is thank you for coming this week and doing this. This is amazing. Every week we talk, new things happen, new ideas come up. It seems to be the theme this week that AI is overpromising, but we also need to upskill ourselves and keep realistic expectations, and just keep kind of a level head about things. And if we do that, then it'll be useful and it will kind of live up to the hype. But we have to do our part to make sure that we're using it productively and also living up to the hype, basically.
Yeah, and your point was really good about how we become used to a technology. I couldn't fix my car,
Uh-huh.
right? But it does something really valuable for me. I don't have to be a mechanic to have and use a car.
Yeah.
So we adopt technologies. The cell phone is a miracle. It's just like I could never build a cell phone. I could never
Uh-huh.
do any of the things associated with it. But it's a very wonderful and useful tool. So I'm both appreciative of it and very dependent on it.
Yeah.
And so I guess we've looked at AI from the same perspective, which is what we are building a dependence on AI, and is that the right thing?
Yeah. And I guess time will tell. We'll see what happens.
Okay, lots of fun, Reed. See you later today for the boot camp.
Yes.